Okay. So, give me a helping hand. What are living organisms made of?
Cells.
Good. Actually, okay, and obviously cells are made of biomolecules that we kind of just went over. And then, what are some properties of life? What do you think? What's one property of life? Okay. Does it talk back to you? Never mind. What are the things that, what must life do to be passed on? Reproduce, okay, so that's one thing. Anything else? Sure.
Matter is, like, how would you say it, like, it, like, energy lives on forever.
Oh, okay, so needs energy. Sure.
Consumption of food.
Okay, that's kind of what we were getting at there.
That has to grow.
Grow. Anything else? So does temperature in things fluctuate wildly? Or are they kind of maintained in a kind of a equilibrium state? Anybody? What do you think? Like, you're the temperature, you don't really run outside and freeze to death or whatever.
It equilibrates.
Yeah, okay. So part of that is what's called homeostasis. And that's important because a lot of the chemicals, like certain proteins, like enzymes that allow reactions to take place, they're temperature sensitive. They're sensitive to the amount of, let's say, water in the environment, whatever. So you kind of brackets on where you can actually find life. Let me go back. So regulated steady state, growth, maintenance, responsiveness to the environment. In other words, it gets cold, your body responds by burning glucose or glycogen, raising your temperature. Reduction, inheritance, all that. Now, viruses, we talked about one of the, what are the organisms made of? They're made of cells. And the thing is, viruses don't have cells. So there's a big question about whether viruses are alive. The thing is, viruses do have either DNA or an RNA. And, oh, there's another thing that, by the way, that life does. evolve. Don't want to forget about that. So life changes, and we'll get into how that happens later. Okay, so what about viruses? So viruses don't have cells, but they have DNA or RNA. There's mutations. They pass on that information to other viral particles they make, or they don't make, to get a host to make them. In a sense, a virus is a perfect parasite. Parasites need a host to live on. Viruses have done away with everything, including cells, and then when they need to reproduce and infect and all that, they invade a host, and they use that cellular machinery to make copies of themselves by taking their RNA or DNA and inserting it into cells in the body that'll then start producing viruses instead of further cells. So viruses, as far as I'm concerned, they evolve. Yes?
How long does it take until the virus consumes the host, or it takes full control?
What's that?
How long does it take for the virus to take full control of the host?
Depends. You actually have a whole bunch of viruses in you that are not causing any problems except for maybe mental. No, sorry. I shouldn't have said that. No, but you are living with these viruses, and they're not causing any problems right now. A good example are small chicken pox. Were you ever infected with chicken pox? Okay. Almost everybody has it, but anyway. Yeah. But anyway, chicken pox, actually, the virus climbs up nerves and then inserts it into the nerve's DNA, and after the infection, and hangs out. Doesn't cause any problems, probably because the immune system keeps it under control. Occasionally, people get something called shingles, where you get a renewed infection. But there's a lot of viruses that you have that don't cause any disease in you whatsoever. They become less or non-virulent. There's others, of course, that can be very virulent. That means virulence means how much harm they cause to you. Some viruses, of course, will kill you within a day or two, like Ebola. There's other viruses that will not actually harm you. Well, they'll harm you, but you won't see any symptoms for months or years, like AIDS. There's others that our immune system clears fairly quickly, like the flu or whatever. Okay? So the main thing that you have to remember is that viruses, like any living things, they need to be able to reproduce. That means they need to infect new hosts. Okay? So it's all about transmission. And if being virulent, like making someone really, really sick, enhances transmission, then it might kill you. So there's viruses that are carried by ticks. And some of those are really deadly. The thing is, if you get bit by a tick and you get transmitted, you're not going anywhere, but you might be in such bad shape that the other ticks will be able to get a hold of you and bite you too, so it's transmission. So, on we go. Now, okay, so, this is not the right one. So this is cell theory. All living organisms are composed of one or more cells, except for viruses, but they basically use cells to do everything they need to do. It's just not their own cells. Cells are the smallest structural and functional units of living organisms. Cells come from pre-existing cells. okay? And all life comes from pre-existing life forms, ancestors, which we'll get to when we get to evolution. And then, of course, cells carry genetic information in the form of DNA. And you can have organisms that are made of one cell, like a lot of bacteria, or millions and trillions of cells, like our cells. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, good. Okay. Now, for most of human history, people didn't know cells existed. You couldn't really see them. There are some cells you can see. A human egg cell, it's very small, but you can actually pick it out. It's very, very, very tiny. All cells have a membrane, and then some cells are more complex than others. So cells were discovered in about the 17th century by a guy named Robert Hooke in Great Britain. Because some other people had invented microscopes. And in other words, modern optics was born. And that caused a revolution in two things. Things that were very small you could suddenly see, and things that were very, very far away you could suddenly see in the form of telescopes. So it changed how we viewed the world. And that's how we learned about cells. Cells there are different kinds of cells. There's bacteria. All they really have is a cell wall. Some of them have flagella. Some of them have cilia. They have DNA in them. They have a cell wall. They have cytoplasm, and then they have ribosomes, which they take the DNA is turned into RNA, which is then turned into proteins by ribosomes. Okay, so, and there's no nucleus in a bacteria. There's another kind of cell like that, doesn't have a nucleus, called archaea. It's a new domain of life that people weren't aware of until about, 40 or 50 years ago. This is one of them. And they're strange creatures. They're usually found in really extreme environments. This is the first one that's ever been grown in the lab. Doesn't look like a bacteria. Okay. And then there's eukaryotic cells, which do have nucleus and other things inside them. This is an animal cell on the left, a plant cell on the right. They both have nuclei. They have other things in common. So these are the kinds of cells there are. What do cells do? Well, they interact with other cells. They make biological molecules. They do a whole bunch of, create chemical reactions, obtain energy and nutrients. They reduce, they eliminate waste. They do all these kinds of things that we need, or living things need, to continue on and keep living. Now, so there are 3 domains of life. You guys probably learned about kingdoms. Kingdoms don't really exist anymore. But there's, and this is what you learn about. This is a phylogenetic tree. And there's 3 main branches. One is bacteria. Some of those bacteria actually make, do photosynthesis and make sugars. Others break things down. There's another thing called archaea that I mentioned. And then there's eukaryotes, which are, all these have nucleuses. a nucleus. So, even though bacteria and archaea don't have nucleuses, archaea is actually more closely related to eukaryotes than to bacteria. You might wonder, well, why? Well, it turns out a lot of the physiological processes and chemical reactions they do much closer to eukaryotes. In fact, it looks like eukaryotes are just a branch of archaea that got all these different organelles like a nucleus and mitochondria and things like that. So, in terms of prokaryotes, like I mentioned, archaea and bacteria, they just have free-floating cytoplasm with DNA in it, ribosomes, and a number of other things. It's pretty simple. Same with archaea, whereas eukaryotic cells always have a nucleus. And it's found in animal cells, plant cells, fungi, all multicellular, and eukaryotic cells are found in single-cell eukaryotes, unicellular, like amoeba. Okay, so in terms of size, on the left is a eukaryotic cell. Cyanobacteria that has photosynthetic pigments so it can make sugars. Escherichia coli, E. coli, viruses, tiny usually. And then we've got eukaryotic cells, and this is kind of what they look like. And they've got all these different things in them, like nucleus, which the DNA is in that, lysosomes, ribosomes, cytoskeleton, a whole bunch of things. Okay. So what structures do prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells have in common? They all have a plasma membrane. And basically, if you think about a cell, there's a demarcation of what's inside the cell and what's outside the cell, and cells need to be able to keep things inside and outside. Plants have a cell wall, which is different than a cell membrane, and animals don't have a cell wall. Okay, so here's a plant cell. The reason it's green is plants have chloroplasts, which are actually very much like cyanobacteria that are photosynthetic bacteria. And it turns out they got in there because it looks like a archaea cell engulfed a cyanobacteria, and instead of digesting it, let it live inside itself and started creating a kind of a symbiosis where they both benefit. So chloroplasts are actually just obligate mutualists that are old cyanobacteria. Fungal cells, they're a little bit different. Sometimes they're multinucleated. We're not going to get much into fungi in this class, except to mention that fungi are important. And one of the most important things, besides breaking things down, they're also responsible for certain of the major food groups, namely alcohol, beer, wine. If it wasn't for fungi, we wouldn't have those things. So even though we're not going to cover them, I think they're all central to our lives. How would we actually survive without alcohol in our lives, really? Think about it. Okay? I can't even think about it. It disturbs me too much. Okay. Unicellular eukaryotes, again. These also, I'm not sure what they are, but there's a nucleus in here, there's ER, there's ribosomes, all kinds of things. On the outside, there's cilia, so it can move around. It looks like a paramecium. Okay. So we're going to function mainly on animal cells. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's in them. So mitochondria, if you remember, I said about chloroplasts that they're actually cyanobacteria that have become obligate mutualists. So that plants and other things that do photosynthesis can make sugars. Okay. Well, it turns out that our energy, there's different ways to take glucose and break it down and turn it into an energy source called ATP. There's like the fermentation process, but it doesn't give you much ATP. But there's these things called mitochondria. And these are also bacteria, or they were bacteria. Let's see, which kind of bacteria were they? I forget. They allow us to use glucose in a much better fashion, more efficient. And the same sort of thing happened, probably. An archaea engulfed a proteobacteria. Instead of digesting it, they kind of set up shop. In fact, mitochondria have their own DNA, and we know it's kind of proteobacteria because if you look at the sequence of nucleotides in proteobacteria and in mitochondria, they're very similar. And then there's other things for transcribing and translating DNA into proteins. And there's also there's a cytoskeleton that kind of gives cells their shape, and things to get rid of waste and things like that. So
excuse me.
Yeah.
I've always seen that a lot, like growing up, especially like elementary, middle school biology.
Hold on a second. I'm gonna come back there because I looked out.
I know where you're going.
Okay.
I was saying, I grew up seeing a lot of that, like, basically, I've seen it a lot.
Yeah.
Like, all those names right there.
Yeah.
That's what makes that cell up, or like, what is it?
Yeah.
All those have a lot to make it.
They do. They do. But I'm not going to require you guys to memorize them. But just a few things, like when we learn about the nucleus, when we learn about mitochondria.
I'm just curious, Professor, if I don't know, I'm gonna ask questions.
Yeah, well, you should. Most of everybody else in here probably wants to ask the same questions, but they're too afraid. So, luckily, this class has one courageous person. Oh, I just did so. Well, we'll see what happens. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. So, on the cell surface, cells have to communicate, they have to get rid of things, they've got to bring things in. So, we're going to learn that they have an extracellular matrix. They have a plasma membrane that actually keeps things in and out. Some have cilia and flagella, and then inside there's a cytoplasm, a cytoskeleton, and all these different things, including a nucleus and mitochondria. And we have, in many cases, thousands of mitochondria in our cells. Some cells have a lot more, like muscle cells, because they need a lot of glucose to burn up. They have a lot of mitochondria to do that. Fat cells don't have very many mitochondria. Okay, so here's the ECM, extracellular matrix on the outside of the cell. So just so you know, So this is the cell membrane that we'll get to, but all these things on the outside, like this stuff and all that, that's the extracellular matrix. And a lot of those things are proteins. Some are signaling proteins so that cells can talk to each other. Some are proteins that, let's say, viruses grab a hold of so they can get into a cell. Some are transport proteins. We're learning a lot about that. Because cells have to do all sorts of things in terms of living. So here's plasma membrane. So this is something that's really important. Now, plasma membrane, the most important part is they have this lipid. Anybody remember what a lipid is? It's a fat, right. Okay. And of course, fats don't mix with water. And then there's this, they're actually, the plasma membrane is made of phospholipids. In other words, a phosphorus group tied into a lipid. And they're very important in the cell membrane that kind of keeps things inside and outside. So take a look. So here's our a phospholipid bilayer right here. And then there's other things. There's like a glycoprotein right here, a glycolipid. This is all in the cell surface. Carbohydrate chains, protein ion channels, cholesterol, all these different things. And this is what's called the fluid mosaic model of a cell, or a cell membrane. And it explains, a model is like a hypothesis, but in this case it's one with a fair amount of support. And it's kind of a model about how cells actually work. Okay. So here is a plasma membrane. Extracellular means outside the cell. Intracellular means inside the cell. You can see that these phospholipids, which are these things, they have a hydrophilic head that's attracted to water. And then they have a lipid tail that is repelled, repelled by water. And you've got each of these phospholipids, one pointing in, one pointing out, and they have this layer right here. And that's the extracellular fluid. It's a bilayer because there's two layers of phospholipids. And the hydrophobic tails face each other in the middle and keeps water from pouring through the plasma membrane. And hydrophilic heads interact with the watery environment inside to keep watery stuff inside and outside the cells. And to keep polar molecules, which have a charge, inside or outside as well. So here is again membrane proteins, like I said. Might be transport proteins, things like that. Could be membrane proteins, all kinds of things. Okay. Like here, And you can diffuse across that, but it doesn't require any energy. So, plasma membranes, we're going to learn a little bit about them because they allow cells to do what they need to do. So, they have what's called selective permeability. They let certain things in and not other things. Big molecules, they don't let in. Some things, small molecules can actually can go through. In fact, like water is a small molecule that can actually go through to a limited extent. We'll learn about that. It's called osmosis. But there's transport proteins that bring in glucose so that the mitochondria can do their work and produce energy. There's gradients of, let's say, minerals. Might be a high gradient outside the cell, and a lower gradient inside, or in the mitochondria, outside the mitochondria, inside. And so things can move across using diffusion, but there's others where you actually need to expend energy, let's say against a gradient. And so they require active transport. And there's others that still need a specific protein, transport protein, but they don't need necessarily energy to move across. Okay. So, diffusion. This is where we're talking about water. And actually, there's other liquid substances, but for now, we're just going to talk about water. And in a solution, you have something that's dissolved in water, a solute, and then you have the water itself. And water usually equilibrates, let's say across a membrane, so that there's equal amount of solute on both sides. So if you have more of, let's say, a mineral on the outside than the inside, in water, there would be osmosis bringing the minerals inside. So in diffusion, because it's a gradient, you don't need energy to make it happen. So let's say we've got oops. And then we've got a membrane, let's say. They share a membrane. And let's say we've got these particles over here, got lots of them. And over here we have none. With diffusion, the particles will cross the membrane and diffuse across until you have equal concentration on both sides. Okay. So simple diffusion doesn't require energy, doesn't require transport proteins, anything like that. And then facilitated diffusion is diffusion through a membrane that actually requires a transport protein. So it's called diffusion. Okay. Oh, you want to answer? Oh, okay, let's, I'll see what I can do. Yeah.
Wait, so does diffusion happen between cells, or does it happen between the mono or the?
It happens outside of a cell, inside of a cell, sometimes between cells. sometimes in a cell, the mitochondria, outside of mitochondria, inside of mitochondria.
Okay, so it can happen.
And all, yes, all over the place. Exactly. Good question.
The plasma membrane stands as a barrier between the inside and outside of a cell. Its ability to maintain a separate internal environment for the cell is one of the plasma membrane's most critical functions. With its 2 layers of phospholipids, the membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. Each phospholipid has a phosphate head and 2 fatty acid tails. The head group is polar, meaning that it is water-loving, or hydrophilic. The tails are nonpolar. They are water-fearing, or hydrophobic. When phospholipids are mixed in water, they naturally come together to form bilayers. While the phospholipid heads are attracted to water and to each other on the outer faces of the bilayer, the tails retreat from water and interact with each other on the inside of the bilayer. The self-organization of phospholipids continues as they assemble into spheres of bilayers called liposomes. The plasma membranes of cells are more complex than the relatively simple membranes of liposomes, in part because they also contain numerous proteins, including transport proteins that act as gates, channels, or pumps. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable. Some substances can cross the membrane, others are excluded, and still others can pass through the membrane when they're aided by transport proteins. Ions, because they're charged, cannot penetrate the hydrophobic interior of the membrane directly. Sugars, because they are polar and large, also cannot pass. However, a few small molecules, including water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen, are able to cross the membrane. Their movement is called simple diffusion. It's a type of passive transport. In passive transport, the movement of molecules is spontaneous and occurs without the need for added energy. Most substances, if they're to cross the membrane, require specialized transport proteins. This movement is called facilitated diffusion and is also a type of passive transport. A potassium ion channel permits potassium ions to cross. A glucose transporter brings glucose across the membrane, and a calcium channel creates a passageway for calcium ions. In passive transport, substances move across the membrane by diffusion, which means that the overall direction of the movement is from a higher concentration of a particular substance to a lower concentration. In diffusion, the ions or molecules tend to move in a direction that would ultimately equalize their concentrations on both sides of the membrane. Some transport proteins are sensitive to cellular signals and may use gates to restrict the passage of particular substances. All movements of substances through the plasma membrane occur by either passive transport or by a second type of transport called active transport. Active transport requires an input of energy. Molecules require active transport when they're moved from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. In this example, the cell is pumping out sodium ions and pumping in potassium ions. The sodium ions are moving to a region of higher sodium concentration, and the potassium ions are moving to a region of higher potassium concentration. Note that the direction of movement in active transport is the opposite of diffusion. Active transport further concentrates a substance on one side of the membrane and requires energy to do so.
Okay, so remember, you always go from high concentration to low concentration. The only time you can go against that is if you actually use transport proteins and energy to pump across that membrane, okay? So eventually, both sides will have equal concentration. When there's high concentration to low concentration, you don't require any energy. It's only the other way around where you require energy. Okay. So, for example, you put in some dye and some water, and it quickly diffuses so that dye particles are spread equally throughout the water. That is simple diffusion. And of course, if you had a membrane between the two, then the red would go across and equilibrate too. Okay. Osmosis is one of the primary processes, mainly because we're mostly water. I know we don't look like we're exactly water, but we're about 70%. In fact, if you get much below that, you get dehydrated and you get in trouble. Okay, so remember in a solution, let's see. You have a solute, which is, let's say, molecules of sodium or something, and it's dissolved in water. And when it's isotonic, it means that there's equal concentration on both sides. Iso means equal. When cells are surrounded by fluid with a higher solute concentration than the cell's interior, then they're called hypertonic. And then, when cells are surrounded by fluid with a lower solute concentration, they're hypotonic. Now, there's also can be a process where the concentration of water is different on both sides of the membrane. And in that case, you have diffusion of the water molecules across the membrane until they equilibrate. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So, now, there's, like I mentioned, there's other ways to get things inside and outside of the cell. And to get things in the cell moving around to different parts of the cell. So, there's things called vesicles, which are basically, let's say you have a big cell, like this. Let's say you've got a nucleus. And sometimes you have to keep certain substances in the cell away from other parts of the cell, but they have to get from one part of the cell to another. In that case, they form vesicles around it, and then these vesicles move around, or they can actually move outside the cell. This is kind of what happens with neurons. So here we have a neuron. Okay, this is where the signal goes that way. And you have neurotransmitters and upper area. Vesicles are formed carrying neurotransmitters, and they're carried to the end of the neuron. And then there's another neuron over here, and the neurotransmitters are released across the membrane. So they're transported in vesicles. Okay, now, exocytosis means that you're taking a vesicle and you're transporting it out. Endocytosis in. What happens is a vesicle has a plasma membrane itself, and it fuses with a cell's plasma membrane and then disgorges whatever it's carrying. The same thing from inside to outside to inside. Right up in this there's different kinds of endocytosis, non-specific and specific. Endocytosis with a particular kind of molecule, specific, non-specific, any kind of material. It could be like a lysosome that's transporting waste products, all different kinds. Endocytosis brings things in, sometimes requires a special membrane protein to recognize it and allow it in. Phagocytosis, where it engulfs a large substance, and some other ones, but I'm not going to require you guys to memorize that. And we'll call it good for there, and then go on with more.